So now we're going to walk through some very, very, very preliminary, frequently made mistakes for assignment 3. There's only been a handful of people who've contacted me, but these are the things I saw they ran into. Please make sure you name your method here recommendations. In other words, omit the get part. That is probably a botch in my skeleton. I will probably fix it at some point, but for now, just humor me and call it recommendations, not get recommendations. It probably should be get recommendations because everything else is called get recommendations, like the stuff here. Down here, what you need to be doing is checking to see whether the value of the strategy equals parallel flux. If it doesn't, then you throw the illegal argument exception, but don't just check to see if it's blank. And then down here, like I said, these methods should be recommendations timed and recommendations with lowercase r. Could be done better, will be done better, but that's what the tests are checking for right now. Switching over to the ParallelFlux service side of the house. So there's some subtle code here. Most people seem to be getting the general gist of it. But for get recommendations, this is the one that takes a single watched movie. Step 1 expects you're calling a helper method defined further down. And so this code here is not necessarily entirely wrong. There's a helper method defined down at the bottom of the file that does all that stuff. And so call that because it factors out common code. So all this stuff is not necessary. It can be subsumed elsewhere. And another thing very important in reactive programming, please try to get in the habit of never calling block. So there's no need to call block here. You can just take this thing back as a flux, and there's actually a helper method that takes a flux and goes and computes the max count top recommendation. So you don't need to call block. So definitely don't call block. That defeats the whole purpose of using reactive programming and reactive types. And then down here, another subtle issue. There's some code you have to write where you're going to take the watched movies list and create a new local version called watch movies copy or valid watch movies or whatever you want to call it. That's basically going to only include watched movies that are actually in the database. If somebody says, go find me a watched movie that doesn't exist in the database, there's no sense in trying to find the matches for it because it won't exist. So the first thing you need to do is modify or create a new copy that excludes all the stuff that is not in there. And please use a stream for this, and don't make a copy with array list. We're trying to get away from that. It's error prone and problematic. By the way, it's an interesting question. Why do we make a copy of this thing? And I think reasonable people might have different points of view. The main motivation is you generally don't want to modify the contents of a parameter unless you really know what you're doing and unless you're absolutely sure that nobody who's calling you will be surprised if the values change when the call comes back, and it should be documented. And in this particular case, the test program was expecting that the list was not modified. So if we modify it on the parameter, we have violated the contract, if you will. And down here, that's why we make the copy. So the other thing is that there's a flux stream here, and one of the entries is map. And this code is way too complicated. You don't need to do this. In fact, whenever you find yourself starting to write Java 5 style for each loops in a reactive program, it's probably a sign that something's gone awry. So if you were to take a look, you'll see that there's a sum of cosines method in the cosine similarity utils. You want to absorb all of this code and just call the sum of cosines method in the right place to do this work for you. So that can be greatly simplified and should be greatly simplified in order to pass the test and to be more thoroughly reactive. Okay, so that's what I've seen so far. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. It's kind of a fun assignment because it pulls all the different pieces together, and you can see where we were headed the whole semester, which was to get recommendations out of this thing.